All right, welcome back to lecture number 45. This is 5.11, the failure of Reconstruction, and the theme is American and national identity. This is the second to last lecture of period 5. We are getting close to the end here. The learning objective for today is explain how and why Reconstruction resulted in continuity and change in regional and national understandings of what it meant to be American. There's a lot of stuff going on here in this learning objective, but what you really have to focus on is the understanding of what it meant to be American. How is it the same going from the beginning of Reconstruction to the end of Reconstruction, and how has that understanding of what it means to be an American changed? And does it vary across the different regions? Was there any change in the North, or was there any change in the South? Was it continuous in the North, or was it continuous in the South? All right, so the first key concept is Southern plantation owners continued to own the majority of the region's land even after Reconstruction. So white Southerners end up going back to the same positions of influence that they had in before the Civil War during the antebellum period. So the Redeemer governments are these white Southern Democrats who were part of the Confederacy or supported the Confederacy are regaining their political and economic influence. And when they begin to control these governments, they start passing black codes. These are laws that are passed in order to control the black population. They prohibited African Americans from taking loans to purchase land, from testifying against whites in court. They even went so far as to make laws to keep them, or to make it illegal for them to be unemployed. If they were unemployed, then they could be sent to jail and then put to involuntary labor. Now, the Redeemer government is caricatured on the left side, or in the picture on the left. You see three Southerners. One of them is Nathaniel Bedford, who's created the KKK, and other Southern politicians standing over an African American with an American flag on the ground. Another example of the Redeemer government is Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president of the Confederacy, seen on the bottom right, ends up regaining his position as senator from the state of Georgia shortly after the end of the Civil War. He was one of the senators who is kept from taking their seats in 1866 when Congress and the Republicans in Congress say that the southern states need to meet a higher threshold in order to be restored to the Union. Now, despite owning land, whites still needed labor. So they still needed people to work the farms that produce cotton or other types of agricultural crops. So they turned to new forms of labor like tenant farming and sharecropping. So former slaves sought land ownership, but they generally fell short of self-sufficiency as an exploitative and soil-intensive sharecropping system limited blacks and poor whites access to land in the South. So tenant farming was the first of these new methods. Farmers would use their own tool, their own seed, and they would pay to rent pieces of land from these large landholders. And at the end of the harvest, they would sell their crops, try to make money, and then continue paying into the system. But usually, as the soil's quality continued to deteriorate, the crops weren't as valuable, they couldn't grow as much, and so therefore they made less money, and it ended in an accumulation of debt for the tenant farmers. Sharecropping was similar to tenant farming, except it was more reliant on the landowner. So farmers used the tools, the seed, and the land of the landowner, and then instead of paying with cash for their rent, they paid with a portion of the crop at harvest, as much as 50% of the total crop. This ended in more accumulation of debt, and it lengthened the contracts to pay off the debts because sharecroppers often ended a season of growing in debt to the landowner. And the only way that they could pay the landowner back is to extend their contract of being on the land. So it made a de facto version of slavery where slavery had already supposedly ended due to the 13th Amendment. Now, the images that you see on the screen, they look a little bit more modern than the Reconstruction period, the one on the bottom right you can see is in color, and that's because the sharecropping system went into the 20th century. Up until the 1940s, there were still sharecroppers in the South in the United States. Now, segregation, violence, the Supreme Court decisions, and local political tactics progressively stripped away African American rights. This was one of the biggest failures of Reconstruction, is that the gains on equality are going to be slowly taken down. So 1876 is usually what we mark as the end of Reconstruction due to the election of Rutherford B. Hayes. He's given the presidency over the New York Democrats Samuel Tilden in the Compromise of 1877. The cartoon at the top by Thomas Nast depicts this compromise that the North and the South are making an agreement at the expense of equality, at the expense of all of those who died in the Civil War for this objective that is now being compromised. Hayes promises to remove the last troops from the South and does little to curb the black codes and the infringements on equality that are being passed by these Redeemer governments. So segregation begins to be implemented across the South. Jim Crow laws, which are laws that segregate blacks and whites, begin to be passed by the Redeemer governments in the 1870s. The name Jim Crow comes from an old minstrel show and minstrel song. These were like variety shows in the South, and it is a highly racialized portrayal of a black person. You see on the bottom left how they're depicted in ratty old clothing with broken shoes. They're depicted as being dumb or unintelligent. And so that's what the names of the laws took after, to try and keep blacks and whites in the South separate from each other. Now, there's also violence that comes along. The KKK is created in 1867. In the White League, another white supremacist group that's threatening African Americans with lynchings, is created in the 1860s and 1870s, and there is a federal response to this. The Force Acts are passed by Congress in order for them to take control and to, at the very least, protect their physical safety of African Americans. But the KKK will spring up again in the early 20th century, and then again in the late 20th century with a third iteration of the Klan. Now, as far as Supreme Court decisions, there are two cases that are going to be important. The slaughterhouse cases in 1873 are going to weaken the 13th and 14th Amendment, and the civil rights cases in 1883 are going to declare the Civil Rights Act of 1875 unconstitutional. So the civil rights cases are more important because they are limiting Congress's ability to enforce these constitutional amendments that are trying to guarantee the rights of citizens. So the civil rights cases was not a unanimous consent in favor of diminishing the power of the Reconstruction Amendments. There was one Supreme Court Justice, John Marshall Harlan, who wrote a dissent against the majority opinion of diminishing the power of these amendments. And part of his dissent is printed up here. He says, "Today, it is the colored race which is denied by corporations and individuals wielding public authority, rights fundamental in their freedom and citizenship. At some future time, it may be some other race that will fall under the ban. If the constitutional amendments be enforced according to the intent with which, as I conceive, they were adopted, there cannot be in this republic any class of human beings in practical subjection to another class, with power in the latter to dole out to the former just such privileges as they may choose to grant." So he's being very clear that he interprets the Reconstruction Amendments as being very direct in trying to give equality to all people, that one group cannot choose how many or how few rights another group may be able to get. And the local political tactics include the vagrancy laws. These are the laws that make it illegal to be unemployed when usually men were charged with being unemployed, and they were put in jail, and then they were being put in convict work gangs. These convict work gangs would be hired out to plantation owners, and so it would be another form of coerced labor. So the Black Americans convicted of a crime, they could be sentenced to involuntary servitude, which the 13th Amendment technically allowed, because while involuntary servitude did not exist in the United States, it did make an exception, except for a crime for which someone has been duly convicted. All right, so despite all of those failures, the 14th and 15th Amendments are going to be important. They're going to stay on the books. They won't be repealed. And then in the 20th century, they are going to be the foundation for future civil rights cases. So they became the basis for court decisions upholding civil rights in the 20th century. The 14th Amendment will be necessary to apply the rest of the Bill of Rights to the states beginning in 1925 in the court case Gitlow versus New York. In this court case, the Supreme Court says that given the wording of the 14th Amendment saying that no state shall create a law that's going to infringe on the citizens' rights, it means that the states cannot make any laws that are going to infringe on the civil liberties granted by the Bill of Rights. Previously, states could, and the Bill of Rights only prevented Congress from making laws that could infringe on people's civil liberties. In 1954, school desegregation is going to be declared in the court case Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, and it was decided based on the 14th Amendment. Linda Brown, who was the young child who was suing to go to a integrated school, or to integrate her school, is said to have had her due process and equal protection rights infringed upon through segregation, and so therefore all schools must desegregate in 1954, even though it takes several years for it to actually happen. And then later on, the 15th Amendment will later be used to strike down the grandfather clauses, which were trying to limit the amounts of African Americans who were voting in the South, and all white primaries. So these were elections that would choose who is going to run in a general election. And because the primaries are held by political parties, the political parties for a time, up until the court case Smith versus Allwright, could discriminate against black voters and could keep them from voting in the primary. All right, so here's the recap. White Southerners regained their political and economic influence throughout Reconstruction, and sharecropping and tenant farming tied blacks and poor whites to the land. Reconstruction's end is usually marked with Hayes's election. The collection of actions to undo the gains of equality for African Americans are really what ended Reconstruction. We talked about how it was done through local political tactics, the Supreme Court decisions, and violence. And finally, the 14th and 15th Amendments will be used in the 20th century to solidify the gains of equality. All right, thank you for watching. We have one more lecture left in period 5, and so I'll see you then.